The cobbled streets of Florence are silent under the cover of night. Only the flicker of a distant torch casts long, twisting shadows against ancient stone walls. A lone figure moves swiftly through the labyrinth of alleys, his cloak whispering against the damp stone. He carries no lantern, leaving no trace but the faintest echo of footsteps. Who is this man, and why does he slip unseen through the heart of the Renaissance? This is Florence in the 15th century, a city of dazzling art and whispered secrets, where fortunes are made and lost in the shadows. And at the center of it all, the Medici family. They began as bankers, ordinary merchants in a world of silk and gold, but their ambition knew no bounds. Within decades, they would become the hidden rulers of Florence, pulling the strings of power with a blend of cunning, charm, and cold calculation. How did a family of moneylenders rise to dominate one of the most vibrant cities in history? Their story is not one of open conquest, but of quiet, relentless strategy, of alliances forged in backrooms, debts called in at just the right moment, and art wielded as a weapon. The Medicis didn't just accumulate wealth, they rewrote the rules of influence. They funded geniuses like Michelangelo and Botticelli, turning Florence into the cultural crown jewel of Europe, all while burying their darkest maneuvers beneath layers of patronage and piety. But behind the dazzling frescoes and grand cathedrals lay a web of betrayal, vendettas, and even murder. This is the shadowy rise of the Medici, a tale where gold and blood flow in equal measure. It's a story of how power truly works, not through sheer force, but through the subtle art of control. Over the next minutes, we'll unravel how a single family transformed themselves from outsiders into dynastic rulers, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes today. Were they visionaries or villains, patrons of the arts or puppet masters of politics? The answer lies in the shadows, where the Medici's true genius and their ruthlessness comes to light. So let's step into the dimly lit corridors of history and uncover the secrets they never wanted you to know. The story of the Medici doesn't begin in the marble halls of Florence, but in the rugged hills of the Mugello Valley, a patchwork of farmland and forests north of the city. Here, the family lived as minor landowners, far from the glittering wealth of Renaissance bankers. Their name first appeared in records as humble wool traders and moneylenders, dealing in the kind of small loans that kept local farms running. But ambition ran deep in their blood. By the late 13th century, they began migrating to Florence, drawn by its booming economy and the scent of opportunity. It was Giovanni di Bicci de Medici who changed everything. Born in 1360, he didn't just enter banking, he reinvented it. While other Florentine families hoarded gold in vaults, Giovanni saw money as a living thing, something to be moved, multiplied, and wielded. He built his fortune on two revolutionary ideas: offering loans at lower interest than his rivals and cultivating loyalty among the working class. While the old nobility sneered, Giovanni quietly bought their debts, turning their contempt into dependence. But his true genius was political. Florence was a republic in name, but power shifted like sand between warring factions. Giovanni avoided the spotlight, preferring to pull strings from the shadows. He funded public works, won over guilds with generous loans, and positioned his family as champions of the people, all while his rivals tore each other apart in open conflict. When the Albizzi family purged their enemies in 1400, exiling hundreds, the Medici stayed untouched. Giovanni had built something more valuable than wealth, influence that couldn't be erased with a single decree. By the time he died in 1429, the Medici name was no longer just associated with coins, it was synonymous with survival. His son Cosimo would inherit not just a bank, but a blueprint for power. The family's rise wasn't luck, it was calculation. Every florin lent, every alliance forged, every enemy ignored until the right moment, all part of a plan as meticulous as the ledgers Giovanni kept. And Florence, for all its art and glory, was just the beginning. Giovanni di Bicci didn't just run a bank, he built an empire of money that stretched across Europe. While other Florentine bankers focused on short-term gains, he played a longer game, turning the Medici name into a symbol of trust and discretion, his most revolutionary move. The branch system. Instead of keeping all his wealth in Florence, he opened offices in Venice, Rome, Geneva, even as far as Bruges and London. Each branch wasn't just a place to store coins, it was a hub of intelligence where merchants, politicians, and clergymen exchanged not just money but secrets. One of his boldest strokes was courting the papacy. At a time when the church was both the wealthiest and most corrupt institution in Europe, Giovanni offered something priceless: reliability. While other bankers charged exorbitant interest or delayed payments, the Medici Bank handled the Pope's finances with precision. They collected tithes from every corner of Christendom, transferred funds between distant cities without moving physical gold, and even financed the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. In return, the Medici gained something even more valuable than papal gold: immunity. When rivals faced excommunication or taxes, the family operated under the Vatican's protection, their debts blessed like Holy Writ. But Giovanni's genius wasn't just in who he bankrolled, it was in how. He pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, turning chaotic ledgers into precise maps of power. Every transaction recorded twice, every florin accounted for, with margins so consistent they became the standard across Europe. He also invented the holding company, shielding the family's wealth from crashes in any single market. When Venice's trade collapsed or London's wool market stalled, the Medici fortunes remained untouched, diversified like a modern hedge fund. And then there were the loans, not just to princes and popes, but to artists, small merchants, even rival families. Giovanni understood that debt could be a leash or a ladder. To enemies, he offered harsh terms, quietly ensuring their dependence. To allies, he gave generous grace periods, binding them to the Medici cause. By the time his rivals realized what was happening, Florence wasn't just borrowing from the Medicis, it was thinking like them. The city's economy pulsed with Medici gold, their currency accepted from Paris to Constantinople, their letters of credit as good as royal decrees. This wasn't just banking, it was alchemy, transforming coins into influence, ledgers into loyalty. By the time Giovanni passed control to his son Cosimo, the Medici Bank wasn't merely financing history. It was writing it. The Medici's ascent wasn't secured in Florence alone, it was cemented in the hallowed halls of the Vatican. Their alliance with the papacy didn't just fill their coffers, it rewrote the rules of power in Renaissance Europe. When Giovanni di Bicci first extended loans to Pope John XXIII, it wasn't merely a financial transaction, it was a masterstroke of strategy. The church, drowning in debts from wars and lavish building projects, needed a banker who could move money across borders without attracting suspicion. The Medicis, with their sprawling network of branches, became the Vatican's invisible hand, transferring funds, collecting tithes, and even financing crusades. In return, they received something beyond gold, papal favor that shielded them from rivals and rebellions. This relationship reached its zenith under Cosimo de Medici. When Pope Eugene IV fled Rome during an uprising, it was Cosimo who offered him refuge in Florence, housing him in the luxurious convent of San Marco. The gesture seemed generous, but the calculus was coldly practical. With the Pope under his roof, Cosimo gained unprecedented influence over church appointments, ensuring Medici loyalists filled key bishoprics and cardinal seats across Italy. Soon, the family wasn't just bankrolling the church, they were steering it. The implications were staggering. Medici banks handled the sale of indulgences, those controversial pardons for sins that would later spark Martin Luther's outrage. They financed the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, turning spiritual ambition into architectural reality. And when rival families like the Pazzi plotted against them, the Medicis could call upon papal excommunication as a weapon. a divine sanction that could bankrupt enemies overnight. Yet this power came at a price. As the Medicis grew entwined with the church's corruption, they inherited its enemies. The same indulgences that filled their vaults also fueled public outrage, sowing seeds of Reformation dissent. And when the papacy shifted allegiances, as it did during the chaotic years of the Great Schism, the family had to walk a razor's edge, supporting multiple rival popes discreetly to ensure no matter who emerged victorious, Medici interests would survive. Their greatest triumph, however, lay in the College of Cardinals. By the 15th century, they'd placed two Medici popes on the throne of St. Peter, Leo X and Clement VII, men who blurred the line between holy office and family business. Leo famously quipped, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," using church coffers to commission Michelangelo and Raphael while keeping Florence under Medici control through papal decrees. This was power dressed in piety, a divine mandate with ledgers attached. The Vatican's seal didn't just sanctify their wealth, it made their authority untouchable. For nearly a century, the Medicis didn't just serve the church, they became it. And in that sacred fusion of gold and gospel, they built something more enduring than any bank, a dynasty that ruled not by sword but by sacrament. Cosimo de Medici didn't wear a crown, but Florence bent to his will as if he were a king. When his father Giovanni died in 1429, he left behind more than a fortune. He bequeathed a blueprint for power, and Cosimo perfected it. Unlike the brash nobles who ruled through spectacle, Cosimo operated in whispers. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and cultivated an image of humility while amassing control over Florence's political machinery. The city's republican government, with its councils and committees, was a facade one Cosimo manipulated with chilling precision. His strategy was simple yet devastatingly effective. He loaned money to the right people, not just merchants and guild leaders, but the clerks, secretaries, and minor officials who kept the wheels of government turning. These weren't transactions, they were silent bargains, a loan to a councilman's nephew here, a generous dowry for a judge's daughter there, all carefully documented in those meticulous Medici ledgers. Over time, the city's bureaucracy filled with men who owed their livelihoods to Cosimo's favor. Votes were swayed, laws tailored, and rivals isolated, all without him ever holding a formal title. But no rise to power goes unchallenged. The Albizzi family, longtime foes of the Medicis, finally struck back in 1433, accusing Cosimo of plotting to overthrow the Republic, a charge not entirely false. They had him arrested and sentenced to exile. For a moment, it seemed the Medici grip on Florence might break. Yet even in banishment, Cosimo's influence held. His allies in the Signoria, Florence's governing body, stalled and negotiated while the city's economy, so deeply tied to Medici banks, began to falter without him. Then came the masterstroke. After just a year, his exile was revoked, not by force but by popular demand. The very republic that had cast him out now begged for his return. When Cosimo re-entered Florence in 1434, it wasn't as a fugitive, it was as a savior. The Albizzi were exiled in his place, their properties confiscated, their allies purged. From that day forward, no major decision was made in Florence without Cosimo's tacit approval. He built libraries, funded hospitals, and commissioned art that celebrated civic pride, all while ensuring every florin spent tightened his invisible hold. The lesson was clear: true power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply waits, patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Cosimo didn't rule Florence from a throne. He ruled from the shadows, where the real decisions were always made. Cosimo de Medici understood something his rivals never grasped. Gold could buy obedience, but only beauty could buy immortality. While other powerful families flaunted their wealth with gaudy palaces and extravagant feasts, Cosimo invested in something more enduring: the soul of Florence itself. His patronage of artists like Donatello and architects like Brunelleschi wasn't just generosity. It was a calculated reinvention of the Medici image, transforming bankers into benefactors, merchants into mythmakers. Take the dome of Florence's cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. For decades, the gaping hole in its roof had been a civic embarrassment, a symbol of Florentine ambition outstripping its skill. Then Brunelleschi, a visionary with no formal training but endless ingenuity, stepped forward with a radical design. The city's leaders scoffed, but Cosimo, sensing opportunity, bankrolled the project quietly, ensuring the architect had the resources and political cover to attempt the impossible. When Brunelleschi's dome finally soared over Florence, it wasn't just an architectural marvel. It was a Medici masterpiece, a monument to their faith in the city's genius. Donatello's bronze David, another Medici commission, carried an even sharper message. Unlike the pious saints and warriors favored by other patrons, this David was youthful, almost audacious in his nudity, a symbol of Florence itself, the small but cunning underdog triumphing over giants. Cosimo placed it in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, a subtle reminder to visiting dignitaries. This family didn't just fund art, they defined the very ideals of the Republic. Yet Cosimo's most ingenious move was his sponsorship of humanist scholars. He turned the Medici household into a haven for thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato's works, stitching classical philosophy into the fabric of Florentine culture. By reviving the wisdom of ancient Athens, Cosimo positioned Florence, and by extension, the Medicis as the heirs to a grand intellectual legacy. His library at San Marco, filled with meticulously copied manuscripts, wasn't just a collection of books, it was a weapon against the Church's monopoly on knowledge. Even his humility was strategic. While other patrons demanded their faces carved into altarpieces, Cosimo insisted artists depict him kneeling in prayer, a simple citizen serving God and city. The message was clear: his power wasn't tyranny but stewardship. Every fresco, every sculpture, every book whispered the same lie, that the Medicis didn't rule Florence, they loved it into greatness. This was power dressed in velvet. While soldiers enforced authority with swords, Cosimo wielded beauty, ensuring that even those who resented his influence couldn't escape the allure of his vision. By the time he died in 1464, Florence wasn't just a city he controlled. It was a canvas he'd painted himself into forever. The Palazzo Medici wasn't built, it was calculated. Every marble column, every symmetrically arched window, every carefully placed coat of arms whispered the same unspoken truth: the Medicis were no longer merchants. They were monarchs in all but name. When Cosimo commissioned architect Michelozzo to design the family's new residence in 1444, he gave one cryptic instruction: avoid all appearance of ostentation. The result, a facade so deceptively simple it became the ultimate flex of power. Unlike the flamboyant palaces of rival families, studded with gilded statues and garish colors, the Palazzo Medici exuded restrained elegance. Its ground floor was clad in rugged, rusticated stone, a nod to Florentine tradition, as if to say the family remained humble citizens. But ascend to the upper floors and the stone grew smoother, the windows wider, culminating in a crowning cornice so perfectly proportioned it became the architectural standard for Renaissance Europe. This gradual refinement wasn't just aesthetic, it was a metaphor for the Medici rise. From rough-edged newcomers to polished rulers, step inside and the real propaganda began. The courtyard, a revolutionary design at the time, was a masterpiece of psychological theater. Open yet enclosed, it welcomed visitors while reminding them they stood on Medici turf. The walls shimmered with frescoes of the family's emblems, diamond rings symbolizing eternal strength, and feathers hinting at the Medici motto: "It is by virtue that one rises." Even the garden was a chess move, filled with rare classical sculptures that positioned the family as heirs to Roman emperors. But the palace's true genius lay in its dual function. By day, it served as Florence's unofficial seat of government. ambassadors were received in the Sala dei Gigli beneath frescoes of lilies symbolizing Florence, a not-so-subtle suggestion that city and family were one. By night, it transformed into a salon for artists and philosophers, where Botticelli sipped wine under Cosimo's patronage and young Lorenzo, the magnificent, absorbed lessons in statecraft disguised as poetry readings. Most audacious of all was the palace's location. While rival clans clustered near the political heart of the Piazza della Signoria, the Medicis built their fortress on the Via Larga, a bustling trade route. The message power no longer resided in government halls. It flowed through the hands of those who controlled commerce. Even the chapel, hidden behind unassuming doors, revealed the family's audacity. Benozzo Gozzoli's fresco of the Magi transformed a biblical procession into a Medici parade, with family members posing as the three kings and their allies as courtiers, a celestial endorsement of their rule. This wasn't just a home, it was a machine for manufacturing legitimacy, brick by carefully placed brick. By the time Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo inherited the palace, its very walls had become a silent co-conspirator in the family's greatest magic trick, making absolute power look like a civic duty. Piero de' Medici inherited Florence at its zenith, a city gleaming with artistic triumphs and brimming with wealth. But the man who took the reins in 1464 was no Cosimo. Where his father had been robust and calculating, Piero was frail, plagued by crippling gout that left him bedridden for months at a time. His enemies called him Il Guttoso, the Gouty, a nickname that dripped with mockery. Yet in just 5 short years, this ailing successor would prove that Medici power didn't depend on strength. It thrived on fear. The cracks in Florence's loyalty appeared almost immediately. Rival families like the Pitti and the Sodrini saw Piero's weakness as their opening. They whispered in the halls of the Signoria, questioning whether a man who couldn't stand without pain could possibly hold the city together. Even the Medici Bank, that sprawling financial empire, began to wobble as debtors sensed uncertainty. But Piero understood something they didn't. Illness had taught him patience, and patience was a weapon. His first move was pure Medici theater. When a group of oligarchs demanded he return from the family villa to rule within the city walls, Piero didn't refuse. Instead, he arrived on a litter carried through Florence's streets, his swollen limbs wrapped in furs despite the summer heat. The message was clear: even broken, he would not be rushed. Then came the counterstrike, summoning leaders of the merchant guilds to his bedside. He casually produced ledgers detailing their unpaid debts some decades old. No threats were made, none were needed. The real test came in 1466 when the Pitti family allied with Venice to overthrow him. As troops massed at Florence's gates, Piero did the unthinkable: he surrendered. Not to the enemy, but to his own vulnerability. He ordered the city's defenses dismantled, declaring Florence too beloved to be bloodied. The gamble worked. The people, horrified at the prospect of Venetian rule, rallied behind him. When the dust settled, the Pitti leaders were exiled, their palaces looted by mobs shouting Medici slogans. Piero's greatest legacy, though, was one few noticed at the time. Recognizing his own mortality, he quietly shifted power to his 2 sons, Lorenzo and Giuliano, tutoring them in the art of rule even as his body failed. On his deathbed in 1469, he reportedly whispered to Lorenzo, "Florence is a chessboard, never let them see you sweat." Then, as if to prove the point, he died with a ledger in his hands. The numbers, as always, were perfect. Lorenzo de' Medici didn't inherit a throne, but from the moment he strode into Florence's political arena, the city treated him like a king. Tall, athletic, and radiating an almost theatrical charm, he was everything his ailing father Piero was not. A natural performer who could silence a crowd with a sonnet or sway an enemy with a smile. Florence fell under his spell instantly. They called him Il Magnifico, not for conquest or cruelty, but for something far more dangerous: his ability to make power look like poetry. His education had been a Medici masterpiece. Tutors like the philosopher Marsilio Ficino steeped him in Plotto's ideals, while covert lessons from his grandfather Cosimo's old advisors taught him the darker arts of manipulation. By 20, he spoke Latin and Greek, composed bawdy carnival songs, and could recite Dante by heart, all while maintaining a network of spies that stretched from Naples to Constantinople. This was the Renaissance prince perfected, a man who could debate philosophy at dawn and broker a backroom deal by dusk. Lorenzo's true genius lay in balancing brutality with beauty. When the Pazzi family, banking rivals backed by the Pope, tried to assassinate him during Mass in 1478, slashing his brother Giuliano to death in Florence's cathedral, Lorenzo responded with chilling precision. He let the mob tear the conspirators limb from limb, then commissioned Botticelli to paint their executions as a fresco on the city walls. Justice became spectacle, vengeance transformed into art. Yet his greatest weapon was patronage. Under Lorenzo, the Medici household became a whirlwind of creativity, where Michelangelo sculpted under his wing as a teenager and Botticelli's Primavera celebrated Medici weddings as allegories of renewal. He didn't just fund artists, he weaponized their genius, turning Florence into a living advertisement for Medici brilliance. When he sent Leonardo da Vinci to Milan with a lute carved like a horse's head, it wasn't a gift, it was a flex, proof that Florence's cultural cachet outstripped any rival cities. Diplomacy became his theater. Instead of waging costly wars, Lorenzo played Italy's squabbling city-states against each other with treaties and trade deals. He brokered the Peace of Lodi, ensuring Florence's neutrality during conflicts, and secured lucrative alum mines essential for dyeing textiles by outmaneuvering the Pope himself. His secret: he understood that in Renaissance Italy, a well-timed sonnet could be as persuasive as an army. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. The Medici Bank, strained by Lorenzo's lavish spending on art and festivals, teetered on collapse. When he died unexpectedly in 1492 at just 43, the city mourned its golden boy, not yet realizing he'd left behind a hollowed-out treasury and a family unprepared for what came next. Lorenzo had been so magnificent, so larger than life, that Florence never stopped to ask, what happens when the sun sets? The answer would come soon enough, in blood and fire. The scent of incense still hung heavy in Florence's cathedral when the knives came out. It was April 26, 1478, a day chosen with cruel precision. High Mass on Easter Sunday meant the city's elite would all be gathered in one place, their guards left at the doors. Lorenzo de Medici knelt at the altar, his younger brother Giuliano beside him, unaware that the Pazzi family and their papal backers had turned God's house into a killing floor. The attack unfolded with theatrical brutality. As the priest elevated the host, signaling the holiest moment of the service, conspirators moved like shadows through the candlelight. Francesco de Pazzi, a banking rival whose family had once been Medici allies, lunged first at Giuliano. His dagger struck 19 times, each thrust fueled by years of simmering resentment. Blood splattered across sacred vestments as Giuliano collapsed near the choir screen. Across the nave, Archbishop Salviati's henchmen descended on Lorenzo, but the Magnifico reacted with the reflexes of a man who'd spent his life expecting betrayal. He whirled, taking a glancing wound to the neck before drawing his own sword and fighting his way to the sacristy, barricading the bronze doors behind him. What the conspirators hadn't accounted for was Florence itself. As news of the attack spread, the streets erupted not in celebration of Medici's downfall, but in fury. The people remembered Lorenzo's carnival songs, his open-handed patronage of their festivals. They remembered Giuliano's famous jousting victories, his charm that made nobility feel approachable. Most of all, they remembered who filled their purses, and it wasn't the Pazzi. By sundown, a howling mob had dragged Archbishop Salviati from the palace where he'd taken refuge, hanging him from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria in full ecclesiastical vestments. Francesco de Pazzi met an even grimmer fate, gutted by the crowd. His corpse paraded through the streets before being tossed into the Arno like common refuse. Lorenzo emerged from hiding not as a victim but as an avenging prince. He turned the conspiracy's failure into a masterclass in political theater. Botticelli was commissioned to paint portraits of the hanged conspirators on the outside walls of the Bargello, a warning in pigment and plaster. Every Pazzi ally was rooted out, their properties confiscated, their names scrubbed from civic records. Even distant relatives found themselves barred from marrying or holding office, their bloodline effectively erased. Yet Lorenzo's true vengeance was more subtle. He had the corpses of the main conspirators, including Jacopo de Pazzi, the family patriarch, dug up from consecrated ground and dumped in an unmarked pit. Then came the legal coup de grace. He banned the very name Pazzi from Florence, ordering all documents to refer to them only as the traitors. The message was clear. Challenge Medici rule, and you risked not just death but oblivion. The aftermath reshaped Italian politics. Pope Sixtus IV, who had blessed the plot, found himself facing an unexpected adversary, not in sword or statute but in commerce. Lorenzo froze all Florentine banking transactions with Rome, bringing Vatican finances to a standstill until the pontiff was forced to lift his excommunication. It was economic warfare centuries before the term existed, proving that in Renaissance Italy, money could humble even God's vicar on earth. By the time the blood dried, the Medicis weren't just rulers, they were untouchable. The failed assassination became their founding myth, proof that Florence would defend its first family against all comers. But beneath the triumph lurked a darker truth. The Pazzi conspiracy didn't just cement Medici power, it poisoned it. From that day forward, Lorenzo ruled with paranoid intensity, seeing daggers in every handshake. The golden age of humanist ideals gave way to something harder, colder. The magnificent had survived, but something in Florence's soul had died with Giuliano on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo de Medici never led an army across a battlefield, yet his diplomatic maneuvers shaped the fate of nations. While other Italian rulers brandished swords, he wielded something far more potent: information. His network of spies stretched from the canals of Venice to the fortress of Naples, their reports flowing into Florence like hidden tributaries feeding a river of influence. A merchant's gossip about grain shortages here, a courtesan's whisper about a duke's weakness there, each fragment became a chess piece in Lorenzo's grand strategy to keep Florence safe without firing a single arrow. His finest hour came in 1480, when war threatened to engulf Italy. The Pope and King Ferrante of Naples had formed an unholy alliance against Milan, Florence's key ally. Traditional statecraft demanded troops and treaties, but Lorenzo chose a more audacious path. He walked into the lion's den. Leaving Florence under cover of night, he sailed to Naples, presenting himself uninvited at Ferrante's court. The king, notorious for drowning enemies in boiling tar, initially kept him waiting for weeks. Yet Lorenzo turned the delay into opportunity, charming Neapolitan nobles with poetry recitals and financing their debt-ridden estates. By the time Ferrante finally received him, the Florentine had already bought half his court. The resulting peace treaty, signed without bloodshed, didn't just avert war, it positioned Lorenzo as Italy's indispensable mediator. Even the Ottoman Empire fell under his shadow diplomacy. When Sultan Mehmed II demanded Florentine marble for his Constantinople palace, most Christian rulers would have refused. Lorenzo sent the shipments personally, along with a gift of painters to decorate Mehmed's walls. This seemingly artistic exchange secured something priceless: preferential trade status that undercut Venice's monopoly on Eastern markets. Meanwhile, his agents in Rome kept the Pope too distracted by Vatican scandals to notice Florence's quiet dealings with infidels. The true genius of Lorenzo's statecraft lay in its deniability. His personal letters were written in disappearing ink, his messengers disguised as pilgrims or musicians. When the Duke of Ferrara once intercepted a Medici courier, all he found were sheet music notations until Lorenzo's spies sang the tunes back in Florence, revealing the encoded battle plans hidden in the melody's rhythm. This was diplomacy as performance art, where every gesture, a gifted racehorse, a strategically timed illness during negotiations carried layers of meaning. By the time of his death, Lorenzo had transformed Florence from a regional player into the fulcrum of European power. Kings sought his counsel, popes feared his networks, and rival cities copied his tactics. Yet for all its brilliance, this shadow empire had one fatal flaw. It relied entirely on one man's cunning. As Lorenzo's health failed, so too did the delicate balance he'd maintained. The wolves were already gathering at the gates, sniffing weakness in the air. Florence, drunk on decades of peace, scarcely noticed. Florence had survived wars, assassinations, and financial crises, but nothing prepared the city for the fiery sermons of Girolamo Savonarola. A Dominican friar with the gaunt face of an ascetic and the voice of a prophet, he arrived in Florence in 1490 preaching apocalypse. At first, Lorenzo de Medici dismissed him as just another street corner zealot. But the preacher's message struck a chord in a city grown weary of Medici extravagance. While Lorenzo's court reveled in pagan-inspired art and lavish parties, Savonarola thundered against corruption from the pulpit of San Marco, his words dripping with condemnations of the tyrants who had turned God's city into a den of vice. The timing was catastrophic for the Medicis. When Lorenzo died in 1492, he left the family's fate in the hands of his son Piero, a man with all his father's arrogance but none of his cunning. Within 2 years, Piero's bungled handling of a French invasion turned Florence against him. As Charles VIII's army marched toward the city, Piero panicked, surrendering key fortresses without consulting the Signoria. The streets erupted in fury. Savonarola, seizing the moment, declared it God's punishment for Medici decadence. A mob stormed the Palazzo Medici, looting its treasures, and Piero fled through the back gates like a common thief. What followed was a revolution unlike anything Florence had seen. Savonarola became the city's de facto ruler, transforming the Republic into a theocratic police state. His bonfires of the vanities saw Botticelli himself tossing paintings into flames, while gangs of fanatical children patrolled streets, snatching dice and cosmetics from citizens. The Medici Bank was dismantled, its records burned as symbols of usury. Even the city's carnival traditions were replaced with religious processions where citizens whipped themselves in penance. Yet Savonarola's puritanical reign contained the seeds of its own destruction. When his prophecies of divine wrath failed to materialize, and when his attacks on Pope Alexander VI grew too brazen, Florence's mood shifted. The same crowds that had cheered the Medici's downfall now tired of bread and sermons. In 1498, after the Pope excommunicated the entire city, Savonarola's enemies struck. He was tortured, hanged, and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, ironically on the same spot where Medici foes had been executed decades earlier. The Medicis would return, but Florence had changed. Savonarola's brief rule proved something terrifying, that a city drunk on art and money could just as easily succumb to the lure of zealotry. The balance between culture and control, between splendor and salvation, had been broken, and piecing it back together would require a darker, more calculating breed of Medici. The streets of Florence ran red with more than just Savonarola's ashes, they seethed with uncertainty. With the Medici gone, the city fractured into warring factions, each vying to fill the power vacuum. But exile didn't spell the end of the family's ambition. It forced them to reinvent it. Scattered across Italy, the surviving Medicis, Piero the Unfortunate, his brothers Giovanni and Giuliano, and their cousin Giulio became ghosts haunting Europe's courts, plotting their return from the shadows. Piero's fall had been spectacularly humiliating. Fleeing Florence in 1494 with nothing but the clothes on his back, he bounced between allies like a tarnished coin no one wanted to keep. The Duke of Milan offered hollow sympathy, then shut his palace doors. The Venetian Republic, sensing his desperation, lent him troops not out of loyalty but to probe Florence's defenses. Even his wife, Alfonsina Orsini, had to pawn her jewels in Rome just to keep them fed. But Piro's greatest mistake was banking on brute force. In 1512, he drowned crossing the Garigliano River while leading a mercenary army against Florence, his body swept away like the legacy he'd squandered. The real strategy came from an unlikely figure, Giovanni, the second son. While Piro played soldier, Giovanni cultivated patience. As a child, he'd been groomed for the church, a typical Medici backup plan, but exile sharpened his instincts. From the splendor of Rome's papal courts, he watched Florence's experiment in piety crumble. Savonarola's death had left the city divided between nostalgic republicans and those secretly longing for Medici stability. Giovanni played both sides. He funneled money to underground sympathizers through dummy trading companies while publicly praising Florence's noble republican spirit in letters meant to be intercepted. Meanwhile, in Urbino, their cousin Giulio, the illegitimate son of Giuliano, murdered in the Pazzi Conspiracy, was mastering the art of soft power. Discreet and scholarly, he hosted exiled Florentine artists, turning his court into a salon for disgruntled creatives who missed Medici patronage. When Machiavelli, himself exiled from Florence, came to visit, Giulio made sure their conversations about political theory always circled back to one question: could a republic built on chaos ever truly last? The turning point came from an outsider, Spain. In 1512, Giovanni secured an alliance with Cardinal Francisco de Remoulins, whispering in King Ferdinand's ear about Florence's strategic importance against France. When Spanish troops marched on Tuscany, they came with Medici agents in their ranks, priming the city's elite for restoration. The final push was almost laughably simple. In 1512, after Spanish cannon breached Florence's walls, the Signoria, bankrupt, weary, and out of options, invited the Medicis back to restore order. No conquest, no coup, just a weary city admitting what it had known all along: some debts can never be repaid. Giovanni entered Florence not as a conqueror, but as a reconciler, hugging former enemies in the Piazza della Signoria while his troops discreetly disarmed the Republican Guard. Within months, he was summoned to Rome, not as an exile but as Pope Leo X. The family who had been chased out with torches now held the keys to Christendom itself. Yet the lesson of their exile lingered. True power isn't just about returning. It's about making sure no one dares exile you again. Giovanni de Medici entered the conclave of 1513 as a cardinal, but he left it as Pope Leo X, and with that single vote, the Medici family turned exile into empire. At just 37, he became the youngest pope in centuries, a man who'd spent half his life fleeing mobs only to ascend to the throne of St. Peter. His election wasn't just personal triumph, it was Medici resurrection. From the moment the white smoke curled over the Vatican, every enemy who'd driven his family from Florence now faced an inescapable truth: the Medicis didn't need armies to reclaim their city. They had God on their side. Leo's papacy became a masterclass in blurring the sacred and the political. Beneath the jeweled mitres and pious proclamations, he ruled like a Medici banker. He turned the Vatican treasury into a slush fund for family ambitions, appointing his cousin Giulio as Archbishop of Florence within weeks of his coronation. His first official act, nullifying all charges against the Medici faction still hiding in the city's shadows, effectively erasing their exile as if it had never happened. When Republican holdouts protested, Leo simply bought their silence not with threats, but with church offices and tax exemptions that lined their pockets. Art became his weapon of choice. Raphael's brush transformed the Vatican walls into Medici propaganda, while Michelangelo's abandoned plans for Pope Julius II's tomb were quietly redirected to Florence's San Lorenzo Basilica. the Medici Family Church. Even the Sistine Chapel ceiling, that triumph of sacred art, became a chess piece. Leo delayed final payments to Michelangelo, keeping the temperamental genius dependent on Medici goodwill. Meanwhile, back in Florence, the Pope's agents circulated rumors of divine displeasure, bad harvests, unexplained fires, all framed as punishment for rejecting the Medicis. The final stroke came in 1515, when the Republican government hesitated to welcome Leo's brother Giuliano as Florence's new ruler. The Pope unleashed spiritual artillery. He issued a bull threatening interdict cutting off Florence's sacraments, effectively damning every citizen's soul unless they complied. Faced with eternal consequences, the Signoria capitulated. Giuliano entered Florence not as a conqueror, but as a divinely appointed savior, his path strewn with rose petals by citizens who'd spat on his family's name just years earlier. Leo's reign proved one brutal truth. In Renaissance Italy, a papal tiara could crush armies. By the time he died in 1521, reportedly from malaria, though rumors of poisoned communion wine persisted, the Medicis didn't just hold Florence again. They'd rewritten history itself, turning exile into destiny, and proving that sometimes the surest path to power isn't through the city gates but through the pearly gates themselves. Leo X entered the Vatican with all the subtlety of a Medici carnival float, gilded, glorious, and impossible to ignore. Where previous popes had feigned humility, Leo embraced opulence as divine right. His coronation procession lasted 8 hours, featuring elephants from Portugal, a menagerie of exotic animals, and enough brocade to bankrupt lesser cardinals. But beneath the pageantry lurked razor-sharp political instincts. He inherited a church teetering on bankruptcy, its moral authority crumbling under the weight of corruption. Leo's solution doubled down. By selling indulgences and church offices with unprecedented scale, he turned simony into high art, all while commissioning Raphael to paint saints on Vatican walls as spiritual cover. His most infamous scheme involved funding the new St. Peter's Basilica through salvation vouchers, a move that would later ignite Martin Luther's Reformation. Yet for Leo, this wasn't sacrilege, it was strategy. Every ducat squeezed from German peasants flowed back to Florence, financing his family's restoration. Clement VII, born Giulio de Medici, cut a starkly different figure. Where Leo had been all charm and extravagance, Clement was cautious to the point of paralysis. The illegitimate son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's murdered brother, he'd grown up in the shadows, his very existence a reminder of Medici vulnerability. As Pope, he inherited Leo's debts without his flair for distraction. When Luther's protests exploded into full-blown heresy, Clement vacillated, too pious to embrace reform, too politically weak to crush it. His disastrous flip-flopping during the sack of Rome in 1527 became emblematic, first excommunicating Emperor Charles V, then begging the same emperor's troops for mercy as they burned the Vatican. The invading soldiers reportedly gambled in the Sistine Chapel, using torn-up manuscripts as chips while Clement cowered in Castel Sant'Angelo, his indecision having left Rome defenseless. Their impacts on the family fortune diverged just as sharply. Leo's wild spending on art, wars, and lavish bribes to secure his papacy drained Medici coffers, but his cultural cachet was priceless. By making the Vatican a Medici showcase, he ensured that even as reformers railed against church corruption, no one could deny the family's taste. Clement, by contrast, presided over the unthinkable Florence's second Medici expulsion in 1527. His dithering had left the family without allies when Republican rebels struck. Yet in a twist of irony, this collapse proved their resilience. When Charles V restored the Medicis 3 years later, it was with imperial backing that made their rule unassailable. Clement, the reluctant pope, had inadvertently traded Republican grudges for Habsburg cannons. The legacy of these two men reveals the paradox of Medici power. Leo's brilliance burned too bright, leaving ashes of debt and dissent. Clement's caution looked like weakness, yet planted seeds for dynastic survival. One turned the papacy into a party, the other endured it as penance. Both proved that for the Medicis, St. Peter's throne wasn't about saving souls. It was about securing a family that had learned to treat eternity as just another ledger to balance. The cannons of Emperor Charles V's mutinous army shattered Rome's gates on May 6, 1527, a date etched in blood across Renaissance history. The Holy City, already weakened by plague and famine, buckled under the onslaught of 20,000 mercenaries who hadn't been paid in months. For 8 nightmarish days, the streets ran red. Churches were looted, nuns ravished, libraries torched. The Swiss Guard made their last stand on the steps of St. Peter's, buying time for Pope Clement VII Giulio de Medici to flee through a secret passage known as the Passetto, his robes hiked up as he scrambled toward Castel Sant'Angelo. The fortress became his gilded prison for months, watching smoke rise over a city where imperial soldiers paraded in stolen vestments, staging mock masses with cardinal skulls as chalices. Clement's humiliation was complete, the same indecision that had defined his papacy, wavering between France and Spain, reform and tradition, had left Rome defenseless. Yet in this chaos, the Medici survival instinct flickered back to life. From his cell, Clement orchestrated a masterclass in damage control. He secretly ordered his bankers in Florence to funnel ransom money through Jewish moneylenders, circumventing imperial spies. He persuaded Charles V, who hadn't authorized the sack but benefited from its terror, that only a Medici pope could keep Italy from shattering. Most crucially, he exploited a loophole in divine law. While Rome burned, he quietly annulled all debts Florence owed the Holy See, buying his family's home city's loyalty with the stroke of a pen. Meanwhile, in Florence, Republican rebels smelled blood. With Clement trapped and disgraced, they declared a new republic and expelled the Medici again. But the family had learned from Piro's panicked flight decades earlier. This time, they left assets hidden, gold sewn into convent walls, allies planted in guilds, even a network of artists who coded messages into their paintings. For 3 years, Florence pretended to freedom while Medici agents like the cunning Filippo Strozzi worked the shadows, bribing guards and stockpiling weapons in underground chapels. The turning point came from an unlikely savior, the very emperor whose troops had sacked Rome. Charles realized a destabilized Italy served no one, least of all an empire stretched thin by Protestant revolts. In 1530, his armies laid siege to Florence, this time with Medici banners flying alongside imperial eagles. The Republic fought desperately, even melting church bells for cannonballs, but starvation did what swords couldn't. When the gates fell, Charles installed Clement's bastard nephew Alessandro as Florence's first hereditary duke, a title, not an election. The Republic was dead. The Medici, once merchants who'd ruled by charm and ledger books, now wore crowns. The sack of Rome should have broken them. Instead, it revealed the family's grim genius, their ability to turn catastrophe into opportunity. Clement emerged from Castel Sant'Angelo a broken man, but his compromises bought the dynasty another 2 centuries of rule. The lesson was clear: for the Medicis, survival wasn't about avoiding disaster. It was about being the last one standing when the smoke cleared. Alessandro de Medici rode into Florence under the shadow of imperial cannons, his legitimacy as questionable as the title he now claimed. At just 19, he became the city's first hereditary duke in 1532, not by Florentine consent, but by the decree of Emperor Charles V, who'd grown weary of republics and rebellions. To the people, Alessandro was a living insult, a ruler imposed by foreign steel, rumored to be the bastard son of a Medici pope and a black servant woman. His very existence mocked Florence's republican pretensions, proof that the age of merchant princes had ended. The era of the Iron Fist had begun. The young duke ruled with a paranoia that bordered on prophecy. Every smile hid a dagger, every whisper carried treason. He demolished neighborhoods around the Palazzo Medici to create open killing fields for his German mercenaries, their pikes glinting under the Tuscan sun. Dissenters vanished into the Bargello's dungeons, their bodies sometimes found floating in the Arno, hands still bound. Even his allies weren't spared. When his cousin Cardinal Ippolito de Medici dared criticize his excesses, Alessandro had him poisoned during a hunting trip, a death so sudden the cardinal's lips were still stained with wine at his funeral. Yet Alessandro's most shocking act was turning the Medici palace into a fortress of debauchery. Chroniclers whispered of orgies that lasted days, of noblewomen dragged screaming into his chambers, of a mock court where drunkards wore the robes of exiled republicans for his amusement. The same family that had once commissioned Botticelli now hosted spectacles of cruelty that would make Caligula blush. His one gesture to legitimacy, marrying Charles V's illegitimate daughter Margaret, only sharpened the irony. The wedding feast featured a sugar sculpture of Florence kneeling before the imperial eagle, its wings crushing the city's lily emblem. Then, on the night of January 6, 1537, Alessandro met his own dagger. The assassin was his cousin Lorenzino, a bookish recluse who'd spent months gaining the Duke's trust by praising his tyranny. Lured to a private chamber with promises of a new mistress, Alessandro found himself alone with Lorenzino and a hired killer. The struggle was brief. The Duke took 26 wounds, one for each year of his life, before Lorenzino pinned a note to the corpse quoting Brutus, "The tyrant is dead." In a final grotesque touch, he arranged the body in a suggestive pose, ensuring scandal would outlast even the murder. Florence barely had time to cheer before imperial troops stormed the gates again, installing a new Medici duke. Alessandro's reign had lasted only 5 years, but its lesson echoed through the ages. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and dynasties built on whispered debts and backroom deals will eventually breed monsters. The Medicis had survived exile, assassination, even the sack of Rome. But could they survive the legacy of their first duke? The answer would come from an unlikely heir, his successor, Cosimo I, who would prove that sometimes the darkest chapters forge the most enduring rulers. Cosimo I stepped over his cousin Alessandro's bloodstains with the cold precision of a man who'd studied Medici history and learned all the wrong lessons. At just 17, this forgotten branch of the family was plucked from rural obscurity to inherit a city still reeking of Lorenzino's revenge. Florence expected another weak puppet. What it got was a duke who wielded power like a blacksmith's hammer, reforging the fractured remnants of the Republic into something unprecedented, a police state draped in Renaissance elegance. His first act was pure theater. Summoning the city's remaining oligarchs to the Palazzo Vecchio, Cosimo didn't beg for legitimacy, he staged an execution. Before the assembled elite could protest, soldiers dragged in Alessandro's assassins, their confessions freshly extracted through methods no one cared to describe. As the blade fell, Cosimo reportedly murmured, "Florence has only one ruler now." The message was unmistakable. The age of Medicis begging for approval was over. What followed was a bureaucratic revolution disguised as tradition. Cosimo didn't just suppress republican institutions, he hollowed them out, leaving the shells of councils and committees to rot while real power flowed through his handpicked secretaries. The old Palazzo della Signoria, symbol of civic government for centuries, was renamed the Palazzo Ducale, its walls stripped of Republican frescoes and repainted with scenes of Medici military triumph. Even the city's famed wool and silk guilds, once power centers rivaling the nobility, became mere tax-collecting appendages of the state. Yet Cosimo's true genius lay in weaponizing culture. Where earlier Medicis had patronized artists to glorify Florence, he commissioned works that glorified obedience. Vasari's frescoes in the Palazzo Vecchio depicted Cosimo as a Roman emperor receiving tribute, while Cellini's sculptures recast Republican heroes as groveling subjects. The Duke turned the annual feast of St. John, once a celebration of civic unity, into a military parade with troops marching beneath banners bearing his personal motto, "I alone decide." Beneath the pageantry, a surveillance apparatus took root. Informants lurked in taverns and confessionals, reporting whispers of dissent to the newly created Office of Public Security. When the exiled Strozzi family attempted an invasion in 1541, Cosimo didn't just defeat them, he had their severed heads displayed along the city walls with poetic verses nailed to their foreheads, turning terror into performance art. By the time he crowned himself Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569, Cosimo had achieved what no Medici before him dared: permanent, unquestioned rule. The Republican spirit that once defined Florence was now a museum piece, carefully preserved in Medici-sponsored histories as a cautionary tale about the dangers of freedom. The family that began as bankers now minted something more valuable than gold: the myth that some men were simply born to rule. Cosimo I's coronation as Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569 wasn't just a title change. It was the final metamorphosis of a family that had begun as moneylenders and now sat atop a throne. With papal approval and imperial backing, he cemented what earlier Medicis had only hinted at: that Florence was no longer a republic but a hereditary kingdom in all but name. The ceremony itself was a masterstroke of propaganda. Staged in Rome to underscore papal endorsement, Cosimo wore armor polished to mirror brightness, reflecting not just light but the illusion of divine mandate. The message to Europe's snobbish monarchs was clear: the Medicis weren't upstarts anymore. They were dynasts. Marriage became their new currency of power. Cosimo wed Eleonora of Toledo, a Spanish noblewoman whose dowry included vast estates in Naples, binding Medici fortunes to the Habsburg Empire. Their son Francesco married Joanna of Austria, sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, while daughters were shipped off to French dukes and German princes like diplomatic bargaining chips. Each union came with strings attached: Spanish garrisons stationed in Tuscany, imperial vetoes over Medici policies, but the trade-off was worth it. By the late 16th century, the family who once counted florins now counted kings as cousins. Yet this golden age carried the seeds of decline. Francesco, the first Medici Grand Duke born to rule, cared more for alchemy than statecraft, turning the Palazzo Pitti's laboratories into his personal playground while Tuscany's economy withered. His successor, Ferdinando I, briefly revived Medici prestige by bankrolling the arts and exploiting Vatican connections, but the family's grip on innovation had slipped. Where Cosimo I had commissioned cutting-edge fortresses, his grandchildren collected curiosities: dwarves in gilded cages, exotic animals from the New World, while their rivals in England and Holland pioneered global trade. The rot reached its peak under Cosimo III, a zealot whose puritanical laws drove Florence's once vibrant culture to extinction. He banned theater, taxed Jews into poverty, and sent spies to report citizens who skipped mass. Meanwhile, his heir, Gian Gaston, preferred bedding servants to ruling, leaving the Grand Duchy adrift as European powers carved up Italy around them. When Gian Gaston died childless in 1737, the last Medici ruler was buried not with fanfare, but with the relief of a city long tired of their name. The Medici story ends not with a bang but a whimper: a silent palazzo, an empty treasury, and a title inherited by the Habsburg Lorraines. Yet for all their late irrelevance, the Grand Dukes had achieved one final, ironic victory. They'd outlasted the republic that birthed them, the rivals who'd plotted against them, even the Renaissance they'd helped define. In the end, the family that mastered the art of survival forgot how to adapt. But by then, their legacy was already set in stone, literally. Every fresco, every statue, every street named in their honor ensured that while Medici blood might fade, their fingerprints on history never would. While the Medici men plotted in council chambers and ledgers, their women wielded power from behind palace curtains and sometimes from thrones far beyond Florence. Take Catherine de Medici, orphaned by the family's first exile and shipped to France as a teenage bride. She arrived at the French court mocked as the Italian grocer's daughter, only to become the most formidable queen mother in European history. When her husband, King Henry II, died in a jousting accident, Catherine took control as regent for her sickly sons, steering France through the wars of religion with a mix of lavish spectacle and cold-blooded strategy. Her infamous Flight of the Doves banquet, where hundreds of birds were released from pies to dazzle Protestant and Catholic nobles alike, wasn't just theater. It was psychological warfare, masking her darker maneuvers like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered under her watch. Then there was Maria de Medici, whose short-lived reign as Queen Regent of France revealed both the possibilities and perils of Medici women abroad. Married to Henry IV to settle a debt the Medici Bank had funded his wars, she arrived in Marseille with a fleet carrying not just her dowry but an entire Italian court, painters, architects, even her favorite pastry chefs. Rubens immortalized her arrival in a cycle of paintings that turned political marriage into divine destiny, but Maria lacked Catherine's ruthless pragmatism. When she commissioned the Luxembourg Palace to rival Florence's Pitti, the extravagance alienated French nobles already bristling at Italian influence. Her downfall came not from battlefields but bad loans, when the Medicis themselves refused to bail out her spending, leaving her vulnerable to a coup by her own son, Louis XIII. These queens weren't exceptions, they were extensions of a family tradition. Back in Florence, women like Lucrezia Tornabuoni, mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had set the blueprint. While her husband Pirro the Gouty wheezed in bed, Lucrezia brokered marriages, influenced legislation, and even wrote religious poetry that shaped public piety. Her letters reveal a mind sharper than most councilmen, casually mentioning how she settled that Pazzi matter over dinner. Later, Eleonora of Toledo didn't just bear Cosimo I's 11 children. She managed state affairs during his absences, commissioned the Boboli Gardens as a political statement, and negotiated directly with Spanish viceroys. When plague struck, she personally oversaw quarantine protocols, proving Medici women could rule as effectively as they could breed heirs. The irony. Their very successes made them targets. While Medici men were criticized for greed, the women were demonized as unnatural. Catherine called the Serpent Queen, Maria dismissed as a spendthrift. Yet without them, the dynasty might never have survived its own excesses. They were the quiet strategists who turned marriage contracts into empires, who wielded patronage not just for art but for espionage, who understood that sometimes the most powerful move wasn't in a ledger or on a battlefield but in the nursery, where future kings took their first breaths under a Medici gaze. Their legacy whispers through European history. Power isn't always taken. Sometimes it's inherited, nurtured, and wielded with a velvet glove. While the Medicis are often remembered for their artistic patronage, their most revolutionary investments weren't in paint or marble, but in the stars themselves. Under Grand Duke Cosimo II, the family became Galileo Galilei's most powerful ally, shielding the astronomer even as his discoveries shattered the Church's cosmic order. Their partnership began in 1610, when Galileo named Jupiter's 4 largest moons the Medicean stars, in a stroke of flattery so brilliant it doubled as scientific branding. The dedication wasn't just vanity, it was survival. By linking his findings to Medici prestige, Galileo gave the family a stake in his success, ensuring their political muscle would back his heresies. Cosimo didn't just fund Galileo's telescopes, he built him a stage. When the astronomer claimed the sun, not Earth, was the universe's center, the Vatican erupted. But in Florence, Cosimo offered something Rome couldn't, a pulpit. The Medici court became Galileo's laboratory and lecture hall, where he demonstrated his experiments to nobles and scholars alike. The Grand Duke's protection allowed him to publish The Starry Messenger, a work that might have earned burning elsewhere but here bore the Medici seal. Even as whispers of Inquisition grew louder, Cosimo's diplomats in Rome worked behind velvet curtains to stall Galileo's censure, arguing science and scripture could coexist under Medici-approved terms, of course. This dance between faith and reason played out in Medici-funded institutions like the Accademia del Cimento, Europe's first scientific society. Founded by Galileo's students under Ferdinando II's patronage, its motto, "Test and test again," became a quiet rebellion against blind dogma. Members conducted experiments in pressurized chambers and measured the speed of sound, their findings discreetly circulated in coded manuscripts to avoid papal wrath. When the Church finally forced Galileo's public recantation in 1633, the Medicis made sure his house arrest unfolded in a comfortable Florence villa, where he continued writing under their watchful gaze. The family's scientific legacy wasn't limited to astronomy. Botanist Andrea Cesalpino classified hundreds of plant species in the Medici-funded Pisan gardens, laying groundwork for modern taxonomy. Architect Bernardo Buontalenti experimented with ice preservation in underground vaults, creating early refrigeration methods to chill the family's summer banquets, a whimsical project that unexpectedly advanced thermodynamics. Even their art patronage had scientific undertones. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical sketches, though unpublished in his lifetime, found safe harbor in Medici libraries where later generations of scholars studied them. What seemed like contradictions, piety and progress, dogma and discovery, were in fact calculated balances. The Medicis understood that by controlling the gateways to knowledge, they could shape the future without overtly challenging the past. Their support of Galileo wasn't just about truth, it was about power. In a world where the Church controlled souls and kings controlled borders, the family who controlled the lenses through which reality was observed would ultimately command both. When Galileo muttered his legendary defiance, "And yet it moves," he might as well have been describing the Medici strategy itself. Progress masked in plausible deniability, advancing not through revolutions, but through carefully calibrated nudges under the protection of those who knew how to bend dogma without breaking it. The twilight of the Medici dynasty unfolded not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow, whimpering fade, a series of misfires and missteps that saw Europe's most cunning merchant princes reduced to petty degenerates and laughingstocks. The first cracks appeared under Ferdinando II, whose reign began with promise but dissolved into paralysis as plague and famine ravaged Tuscany in the 1630s. Where his ancestors would have seized crisis as opportunity, Ferdinando dithered, commissioning endless religious processions instead of grain shipments. His one lasting achievement, the world's first recorded weather record's meticulous notes about rainfall while his subjects starved. By the time Cosimo III inherited the Grand Duchy in 1670, the family's genius had curdled into zealotry. Obsessed with sin and suspicious of anything pleasurable, he transformed Florence from a cultural capital into a theocratic backwater. His laws read like a madman's diary: women forbidden to wear ribbons, Jews forced to listen to conversion sermons in stifling summer heat, musicians banned from performing anything not about biblical figures. Even Carnival, the raucous festival Lorenzo the Magnificent had once used to cement populist appeal, was outlawed as devil's work. Meanwhile, his personal life became a grotesque parody of Medici matchmaking. He forced his son, Prince Ferdinando, to marry a Bavarian princess he'd never met, a union so miserable the prince took up with male lovers and died of syphilis in his 30s. Then came Gian Gaston, the last Medici to rule Florence, a man who embodied the family's decline in his very flesh. Obese, alcoholic, and profoundly disinterested in governing, He spent his days lounging in bed with a rotating cast of stable boys and street urchins, emerging only to host drunken dinners where guests vomited into priceless Medici porcelain. The palazzo, once a workshop of statecraft and art, reeked of unwashed linens and rotting food. When advisors begged him to attend council meetings, Giant Gaston reportedly retorted, "Make it a masquerade and perhaps I'll come as myself." The final humiliation came in 1737, when Giant Gaston died childless after a decade of near-total seclusion. His corpse lay unattended for hours before servants noticed, a fitting end for a dynasty that had long stopped noticing its own decay. The Grand Duchy passed to the Habsburg Lorraines, but the real tragedy wasn't the transfer of power. It was how little anyone cared. Florence, once the beating heart of the Renaissance, had become a museum of its own past, presided over by a family who'd forgotten why they mattered in the first place. Yet, even in their decline, the Medicis staged one final, unintentional act of genius. By producing no viable heirs, they ensured their story ended cleanly, no pretenders, no messy succession wars. Just empty coffers, crumbling frescoes, and the quiet realization that all dynasties, no matter how brilliantly constructed, have expiration dates. The Medici didn't fall. They simply faded away, leaving behind the one thing they could never control, time itself. Walking through the Uffizi Gallery today, you're not just seeing art, you're stepping inside the Medici mind. Every fresco, every sculpture, every carefully curated corridor whispers their ambition. This was never just about beauty, it was about control. The family who began as bankers understood something revolutionary. Culture is the ultimate currency, and whoever funds the Renaissance gets to write its history. Their fingerprints are everywhere, not just in the masterpieces they commissioned, but in the very idea of what art could be. Take Botticelli's Primavera, painted for Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin. On the surface, it's a lush allegory of spring, but look closer. The oranges in the grove, Medici symbols, the three graces, said to mimic Lorenzo's daughters. Even Venus's pose echo sculptures in the family's private garden. This wasn't decoration, it was dynasty building in pigment. Their architectural legacy is just as calculated. Brunelleschi's dome, which Cosimo quietly financed, didn't just crown Florence's skyline, it became a visual manifesto. The engineering marvel screamed Medici patronage without uttering their name, a silent rebuttal to rivals who dismissed them as crass merchants. Michelangelo's Palazzo Medici, with its graduated stonework rising from rough to refined, mirrored the family's own journey from wool traders to power brokers. Every architectural choice carried subtext. The round arches borrowed from Roman emperors, the private chapels rivaling churches in splendor, all designed to whisper one message: these were no longer businessmen. They were modern-day Caesars, but their most enduring manipulation was turning artists into both weapons and hostages. Michelangelo lived in Lorenzo the Magnificent's household as a teenager, carving his first works under Medici roofs. Decades later, when the sculptor wanted to refuse Pope Julius II's tomb commission, it was Medici pressure that forced him back to the Sistine Chapel. Even Leonardo da Vinci, who fled Florence for Milan, did so with Medici connections in his pocket. His bizarre silver lute shaped like a horse's skull was a gift from Lorenzo to the Sforza court. The family didn't just collect genius, they weaponized it, ensuring that every brushstroke from Florence carried their influence across borders. Their private collections, now the core of museums from the Uffizi to the Bargello, reveal a chilling foresight. Unlike nobles who hoarded gold, the Medicis hoarded credibility. By preserving ancient Greek manuscripts in their San Marco library, they positioned themselves as guardians of Western thought. Their gemstone cabinets weren't just trophies, they were early PR, proving their sophistication to visiting diplomats. Even their patronage of Galileo, that dangerous dance with heresy, served a purpose. In funding telescopes while publicly towing the church line, they became the indispensable bridge between faith and reason. The bitter irony, the very institutions they created to glorify themselves ultimately outlived their power. Today, tourists line up for hours to see works commissioned to flatter a dynasty that's been dust for centuries. The Medici name endures not in politics or finance, but in the quiet halls of museums where their once private treasures now belong to the world. Perhaps that was their final, unwitting masterpiece, understanding that art lasts longer than armies, that beauty is the ultimate insurance against oblivion. They set out to buy immortality, and against all odds, in gilded frames and marble halls, they got it. Their enemies didn't just lose power, they vanished. The Medici archives overflow with ledgers and letters, but conspicuously missing are answers to the darkest whispers, suspicious deaths, missing rivals, and poisons that left no trace. Take the case of Cardinal Giovanni Salviati, a vocal critic of Medici rule who dropped dead during a banquet in 1543. Contemporary accounts describe him clutching his throat, his face turning violet as Cosimo I calmly sipped his wine. Officially, it was apoplexy. Unofficially, every guest remembered how Salviati had threatened to expose Medici financial fraud just that morning. The physician who examined his corpse, a man on the Medici payroll, declared natural causes before the body was even cold. Then there's the mystery of Isabella de Medici, the brilliant daughter of Cosimo I, whose sharp tongue and political acumen made her dangerous. Married off to a brutish husband to secure an alliance, she was found strangled in her villa in 1576. The official story claimed suicide, yet her neck bore the unmistakable marks of a garrote, a detail conveniently omitted from the autopsy. Years later, secret letters surfaced implying her brother, Grand Duke Francesco, had ordered the killing. The reason? Isabella knew too much about his plot to assassinate her husband, who was also mysteriously poisoned weeks prior. Even their artistic patronage hid sinister clues. The Palazzo Pitti's secret passages weren't just for privacy, they were escape routes. Workers renovating in the 18th century found a concealed chamber behind a fresco, its walls etched with tallies that matched known disappearances of Medici critics. More chilling was the discovery of a hollowed-out copy of Dante's Inferno in Lorenzo the Magnificent's study, its pages gutted to store a powder later identified as arsenic-laced sugar, a favorite Renaissance poison, sweet enough to mask in wine. The greatest enigma, their lost treasures. When Lorenzaccio murdered Duke Alessandro in 1537, he claimed to have stolen a ledger listing every Medici assassination plot. The book vanished, but centuries later, a coded letter surfaced in Vienna's Habsburg archives, hinting it had been used to blackmail later Medicis into favorable treaties. And what of the legendary Nero Diamante, a cursed black diamond said to have been smuggled from the New World, its ownership tied to a string of deaths? The last Medici Grand Duke allegedly had it ground to dust, but palace servants whispered he'd hidden it beneath the Boboli Gardens, where it still waits. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in what wasn't recorded. The Medici Bank's special expenses ledger, a column reserved for bribes and other services, shows staggering payments to court physicians and spice merchants in the weeks preceding rivals' deaths. No accusations were ever proven, no trials held, just a trail of empty chairs at Florence's power table, each vacated just as the Medici needed them to be. Their true genius wasn't in eliminating enemies, it was in ensuring history would only ever call it coincidence. The Medici dynasty's story isn't one of heroes or villains, it's a masterclass in the messy, glittering, and often brutal dance of power. From the moment Giovanni di Bicci set up his modest banking tables in Florence, to the day giant Gaston died alone in a stinking palace, their legacy thrived on contradictions. They were both patrons and predators, visionaries and tyrants, the midwives of the Renaissance and its sharpest manipulators. Look at their greatest triumphs: Michelangelo's David, Brunelleschi's Dome, Galileo's stars, and you'll find Medici fingerprints smudged across history's brightest moments. But dig deeper and darker shades emerge. The ledgers listing payments to assassins, the whispered poisonings, the convenient deaths of rivals who stood in their way. What makes them unforgettable isn't just their rise, it's how they sustained it. They didn't conquer Florence with armies, they bought it piece by piece, turning debt into loyalty and art into propaganda. Cosimo the Elder ruled from the shadows, Lorenzo the Magnificent dazzled with poetry and plots, and Cosimo I crushed dissent beneath jeweled boots. Even their failures were calculated. When they were exiled, they didn't fade, they leveraged papal ties and Habsburg cannons to claw their way back. When their bank collapsed, they simply shifted currency, trading gold for cultural capital that outlasted their coffers. Yet for all their cunning, their downfall carried a warning no dynasty can escape. The same ruthlessness that built their empire, Alessandro's brutality, Cosimo III's puritanical madness, Giant Gaston's debauchery rotted it from within. They mastered every weapon except moderation, and in the end, even Medici gold couldn't buy back their relevance, so were they brilliant or monstrous? Perhaps both. They showed the world how to wield power without a crown, how to shape an era not just with swords but with scholarships and sculptures. But they also proved that unchecked ambition, no matter how beautifully disguised, eventually consumes itself. Now we turn to you. Were the Medicis visionary architects of the modern world, or just the most glamorous mob bosses in history? Could Florence's golden age have happened without their shadowy machinations? Drop your thoughts below, and remember, the next time you admire a Botticelli or gaze up at the Duomo, you're not just seeing art, you're seeing the afterlife of a family who understood that real power isn't just taken, it's curated.